The next calling was that of Atlanteans. This calling was for what we would call understanding with the distortion towards helping other selves. The action taken by the Confederation was the impression of information through channels, as we would call them. The Atlantean race was a very conglomerate social complex, which began to form approximately 31,000 years in the past of our space-time continuum illusion. It was a slow-growing and very agrarian society until approximately 15,000 years ago. It quickly reached a high technological understanding, which caused it to be able to use intelligent infinity in a less informative manner. The next attempt of the Confederation was long in coming and occurred approximately 13,000 years ago, when some intelligent information was offered to those of Atlantis. Entities of the Confederation appeared unto Atlanteans, who had reached a level of philosophical understanding, shall we misuse this word, which was consonant with communication, to encourage and inspire studies in the mystery of unity. There were visitations from time to time, but none of importance in the, shall we say, historical passage of events in our space-time continuum. There were two conditions to these visitations to occur. The calling of a group of people whose square, or what we would prefer to call doubling, overcame the integrated resistance of those unwilling to search or learn. The second requirement, the relative naivete of those members of the Confederation, who felt that direct transfer of information would necessarily be as helpful for Atlanteans as it had been for the Confederation entity. However, requests being made for healing and other understandings, information was passed having to do with crystals and the building of pyramids, as well as temples, as we would call them, which were associated with training. This training was different from that used in Egypt in that the social complex was more, shall we say, sophisticated and less contradictory and barbarous in its ways of thinking. Therefore, the temples were temples of learning, rather than the attempt being made to totally separate and put upon a pedestal the healers. We would not call them priests in the sense of celibacy, of obedience, and of poverty. They were priests in the sense of those devoted to learning. The Atlanteans were, in the early part of their cultural experience, used to lifespans from 70 to 140 years, this being, of course, approximate. Due to increasing desire for power, the lifetime decreased rapidly in the later stages of this civilization, and thus the healing and rejuvenating information was requested. The difficulties became apparent as those trained in this learning began to attempt to use crystal powers for those things other than healing, as they were involved not only with learning, but became involved with what we would call the governmental structure. They used intelligent energy as well, manipulating greatly the natural influxes of the indigo or pineal ray from divine or infinite energy. Thus, they were able to create life forms. They began to do this, instead of healing and perfecting their own mind-body-spirit complexes, turning their distortions towards what we may call the negative. Approximately 11,050 years ago, the first of the what we call wars caused approximately 40% of this population to leave the density by means of disintegration of the body. The second and most devastating of the conflicts occurred approximately 10,870 years in the past, according to our illusion. This created an earth-changing configuration, and the large part of Atlantis was no more, having been inundated. 3 of the positively oriented of the Atlantean groups left this geographical locus before that devastation, placing themselves in the mountain areas of what we call Tibet, what we call Peru, and what we call Turkey. Many were displaced due to societal actions, both upon Atlantis and upon those areas of what we would call North African deserts, to which some Atlanteans had gone after the first conflict. Earth changes continued due to these, what we would call, nuclear bombs and other crystal weapons, sinking the last great land masses approximately 9,600 years ago. The Confederation's next attempt was approximately 11,000 years ago. These are approximations, as Ra was not totally able to process our space-time continuum measurement system. This was in what we call Egypt, and of this we have spoken previously. Others from Ra's density made contact at the same time in South America, and the so-called lost cities were their attempts to contribute to the Law of One. The entities who walked among those in our South American continent were called by a similar desire upon the part of the entities therein to learn of the manifestations of the sun. They worshipped this source of light and life. Thus, these entities were visited by light beings, not unlike Ra. Instructions were given, and they were more accepted and less distorted than Ra's. The entities themselves began to construct a series of underground and hidden cities, including pyramid structures. These pyramids were somewhat at variance from the design that Ra had promulgated. However, the original ideas were the same, with the addition of a desire or intention of creating places of meditation and rest, a feeling of the presence of the one Creator. These pyramids then being for all people, not only initiates and those to be healed. They left this density when it was discovered that their plans were solidly in motion and, in fact, had been recorded. During the next approximately 3,500 years, these plans became, though somewhat distorted, in a state of near completion in many aspects. However, the pyramids of those so-called lost cities were not to be used in the appropriate fashion. Therefore, this was not pursued further. Due to growing thought-form distortions in understanding of the Law of One, the planet itself was seen by the Confederation to have the potential for imbalance. Those of Ra were able to continue work that brothers within the Confederation had effected through building of other crystal-bearing structures, designed for the balancing of the planetary energy web, and thus complete a ring, if you will, of these about the Earth's surface. These balancing pyramids were charged with crystals, which drew the appropriate balance from the energy forces, streaming into the various geometrical centers of electromagnetic energy, which surround and shape the planetary sphere. The group that was helping the South American entities along the South American ways, we call in part the Amazon River, gave up not so easily as Ra. Therefore, as is the case in all breakings of the quarantine, the entity went before the Council of Saturn to request a second attempt to correct in person the distortions which had occurred in their plans. This having been granted, this entity or social memory complex returned, and the entity chosen as messenger came among the peoples once more to correct the errors. Again, all was recorded, and the entity rejoined its social memory complex and left our skies. As in Ra's experience, the teachings were, for the most part, greatly and grossly perverted to the extent, in later times, of actual human sacrifice, rather than healing of humans. Thus, this social memory complex is also given the honor duty of remaining until those distortions are worked out of the distortion complexes of our peoples. In the Egyptian and the South American experiments, though not as widely devastating as the Atlantean experiments, the results were as far from the original intention of the Confederation. It was clear to not only the Confederation, but also to the Council and the Guardians that their methods were not appropriate for this particular sphere. The Confederation's attitude thus was one of caution, observation, and continuing attempts to creatively discover methods whereby contact from their entities could be of service, with the least distortion and, above all, with the least possibility of becoming perversions or antitheses of their intentions in sharing information. In approximately 3,600 years in the past, as we measure time, there was an influx of those of the Orion group, as we call them. Due to the increasing negative influences upon thinking and acting distortions, they were able to begin working with those whose impression from olden times, as we may say, was that they were special and different. Here the Orion group found fertile soil, in which to plant the seeds of negativity, these seeds, as always, being those of the elite, the different, those who manipulate or enslave others. An entity of the Confederation, many, many thousands years in the past, the one we may call Yahweh, had by genetic cloning set up these particular biases among these peoples, who had come gradually to dwell in the vicinity of Egypt, as well as in many, many other places, by dispersion after the down-sinking of the land mass Mu. Some of these genetic changes were in a form similar to what we call the cloning process. Thus, entities incarnated in the image of the Yahweh entities. This and subsequent genetic changes were of one purpose only, that to express in the mind-body complex those characteristics, which would lead to further and more speedy development of the spiritual complex. The characteristics which were encouraged included sensitivity of all the physical senses to sharpen the experiences, and the strengthening of the mind complex in order to promote the ability to analyze these experiences. The one known as Yahweh felt a great responsibility to these entities. However, the Orion group had been able to impress upon the peoples the name Yahweh as the one responsible for this elitism. The entity no longer called Yahweh, who still felt that if it could raise up entities which were superior to the negative forces, that these superior entities could spread the law of one. Thus this entity, Yod He Shin Vav He, came in form according to incarnate being and walked among our peoples to produce further genetic changes in consciousness. In a series of encounters of the nature we know as sexual, in the normal reproductive manner, the ones called Anak were impregnated with the new genetic coding, so that the organisms would be larger and stronger, thus birthing a generation of much larger beings. The ones of Yahweh were attempting to create an understanding of the law of one by creating mind-body complexes capable of grasping the law of one, and were responsible for this procedure as experiments in combating the Orion group. However, the Orion group were able to use this distortion of mind-body complex to inculcate the thoughts of the elite rather than concentrations upon the learning teaching of oneness. The experiment was a decided failure from the view of the desired distortions, due to the fact that rather than assimilating the law of one, it was a great temptation to consider the so-called social complex or subcomplex as elite or different and better than other selves, this one of the techniques of service to self. The results of this interaction were quite mixed. Where the entities were of a vibrational some characteristic, which embraced oneness, the manipulations of Yahweh were very useful. Wherein the entities of free will had chosen a less positively oriented configuration of some total vibratory complex, those of the Orion group were able, for the first time, to make serious inroads upon the consciousness of the planetary complex. Specifically, those who are strong, intelligent, etc., have a temptation to feel different from those who are less intelligent and less strong. This is a distorted perception of oneness with other selves. It allowed the Orion group to form the concept of the Holy War, as we may call it. This is a seriously distorted perception. There were many of these wars of a destructive nature. Approximately, in our past of 3,300 years, Yahweh then was able to take what we would call stock of its vibratory patterns and became, in effect, a more eloquently effective sound vibration complex. In this complex, the old Yahweh, now unnamed, but meaning he comes, began to send positively oriented philosophy. This was a series of dialogues with chosen channels. Thus, the intense portion of what has become known as Armageddon was joined. There were isolated instances of callings, one such taking place beginning approximately 2,600 years in the past in what we would call Greece at this time, and resulting in writings and understandings of some facets of the law of one. We especially note the one known as Thales and the one known as Heraclitus, those being of the philosopher career, as we may call it, teaching their students. We also point out the understandings of the one known as Pericles. At this time, there was a limited amount of visionary information which the Confederation was allowed to telepathically impress. However, for the most part during this time, empires died and rose according to the attitudes and energies set in motion long ago, not resulting in strong polarization, but rather in that mixture of the positive and the negative or warlike, which has been characteristic of this final minor cycle of our beingness. There were a few attempts to aid our peoples approximately 2,300 years ago, this in the area of Egypt. The remaining part of the cycle, the Confederation entities have never been gone from our fifth dimension and have been working in this last minor cycle to prepare for harvest.